afternoon and welcome everyone to the Parliamentary Pavilion. My name is Malini Mehra and I'm Chief Executive of Globe International. And this is, oh gosh, I've lost count of how many events there have been all day, but this is the session which we're going to discuss politics. So they've kind of been kept out of our discussion for most of the events today, but this one of course is on a common climate question mark. Can different parties work together on the climate challenge in an era of polarization? We're delighted to be organizing this in partnership with the Blavatnik School at Oxford University, and we have 4 fantastic speakers, 2 of whom are really going to set the scene for our discussion. If I can just introduce them very briefly, from my extreme right, Carolyn Trench-Sandiford, who is President of the Parliament of Belize. Chris Gidmore MP, who is a Member of Parliament for Kingswood in Gloucestershire in the United Kingdom, and Alex Sobel MP, who is a Member of Parliament for Leeds. And of course, to my immediate right, we have Professor Tom Hale, who's a professor at the Blavatnik School at Oxford University. So the format is going to be that I'm going to hand over to Tom to introduce while we are here. And Tom, you're going to introduce the Visiting Parliamentary Fellowship. And after that, we're going to have opening remarks from both Chris and Alex, and then we're going to have Caroline as a discussant. And then we hope that we'll have at least 15 minutes for a Q&A afterwards. So over to you. Thank you. Tom.
Thank you so much, Malini, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's wonderful to be able to launch the Visiting Parliamentary Fellowship here at COP28. And what is the Visiting Parliamentary Fellowship Series? It is a program that St. Anthony's College at Oxford, which is my college there, has forced the year at the university in order to advance discussion on vital topics. And I'm delighted that this year, which is obviously a year where many are expecting a particularly energetic discussion of politics, we're going to be focusing on a topic that's close to all of our hearts, but also close to in a way that's closer than ever before to the heart of politics, really, which is, of course, climate change. How do we think about climate change as elected leaders who are trying to build a better society for their constituents? So why are we talking about politics and climate change? We know we have the science, we know we have the technology now, and fascinatingly, we increasingly have the economic incentives going in the right direction. But what we don't necessarily have in many countries in the world is a clear political consensus on how to advance on the things we know we need to do. And so that's what the seminar series is really going to dive into. So we're launching it today here at COP28, but it's going to take place throughout next year in Oxford, and we hope we'll see many of you both in person and online as we continue the discussions. And I'm particularly delighted that we have 2 visiting parliamentary fellows this year who are not just going to bring a lot of expertise, but have a lot of experience and insights into this issue, which hopefully will allow us to go much deeper. So thank you, Chris, thank you, Alex, for joining this thing, and congratulations on being named Visiting Parliamentary Fellows this year. We're very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how we take this forward. Wonderful.
Excellent, thank you very much. So I have to remind everybody here who doesn't know Globe that of course the ethos of Globe is very much cross-party cooperation. And we always refer to the almost legendary experience in the UK of developing a bipartisan cross-party consensus around climate action, which has been there for a number of decades now. So we'd love to hear from you both. And the opening question really is, it's often observed that political polarization is increasing around the world. Has that been your experience? It's a rhetorical question, and if so, how?
Well, in the UK, we've clearly, as you said, had consensus for a long time. We've passed quite a lot of legislation consensually, although, you know, obviously in partisan politics, there's been different levels of ambition in different areas of legislation. But we're now coming sort of to a sort of locus point where, unfortunately, and this is a global issue, and I might talk about it in US context a little bit as well. We've got populism trying to undermine the political consensus that has existed, and in the UK that is coming forward, and I think next year that's going to be particularly difficult for climate politics in the UK because we're going to have a general election, and things are going to come apart. So in terms of my own party's programme, the centre of our programme is the Green Prosperity Plan, which is in many ways very similar to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is the centre of Biden's programme, both economic programme and in terms of the green transition. And the is an attack on that. So there's an attack on that about cost. There's an attack on that about economic effect. And naturally, you might want to say that Biden's much cleverer in terms of his framing, because that's an economic framing rather than a climate framing. And there's also issues in the press, and the media's a really important part of this, in terms of constant saying that there's going to be a rollback, and then Labour spokespeople or the leader of the party, the leader of the opposition, has to come and deny that there's rollback, and it creates that sort of debate. But actually, the other thing before we move on and pass over to Chris is the UK casts a very long shadow globally. Our Scope 3 emissions far outweigh our domestic emissions, and it's incumbent on the UK to get political consensus around Scope 3 emissions, which I personally don't think we've had. I think it's been a bit too difficult to deal with Scope 3, so we're going to leave it. And we need to have the same level of legislative ambition and action on Scope 3 as we have had, for instance, on coal-fired power stations, which are a thing of the past. And I think that is where the political difficulty will come. But I think if we're going to be a world leader, carry on being a world leader, we have to tackle Scope 3.
Over to you, please, Chris. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to Globe for hosting this launch event today. I'm delighted to see so many parliamentarians from the UK Parliament in the audience today. Former Secretary of State, Chair of the Environmental Audit Select Committee. And I think it demonstrates, at this particular COP, the importance that parliamentarians play, not just in advocating for climate action, but also in recognising, I think as Globe does overwhelmingly, that it's parliamentarians who act as the backstop, who act as the ability to hold their own executives and government to account. And the Net Zero review that I published for the UK government earlier this year, it really set out the importance of the role of Parliament, of the select committees, in actually demonstrating that the pathway to net zero is not necessarily a fixed one, but there will be changes, there will be rollbacks, there will be bumps in the road, and it's up to parliamentarians to be able to help smooth those out and to provide not necessarily consensus, not necessarily compromise, but the ability to find solutions when the facts change. And I think sometimes the facts can change not in ways that we would like. The facts have changed for me when it comes to net zero. We've seen in the UK, obviously, the UK government take a slightly different position than what they had done previously. For myself, it's important now to recognise that regardless of those changes, how to ensure the UK government maintains its commitment that it's made internationally to the United Nations on its national determining contribution is really important. And obviously, I think the challenge for us as parliamentarians, whether it's Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, Scottish National Party, is to understand that we all want the same outcome, but we may disagree over the detail. Now, I think that is legitimate, and that is the purpose of a democratic assembly, that we should be able to have disagreement over that detail, but at the same time work within certain frameworks. Now, I as a politician, rose up at the time when the Conservative Party was in opposition, and we then decided to both oppose and support the Labour Party. The Labour Party brought forward the Climate Change Act. The Conservative Party supported the overwhelming framework of the Climate Change Act, but actually began by opposing Labour's initial 60% emissions reduction target and said that we can go further faster. We can get to 80%. And actually the Conservative Party in opposition helped strengthen that legislation. I think that's the important role here between a cross-party initiative, is how can we bring the best out in each other. And we see that with our select committee process. We see that in our debates and the amendments that we as legislators can make to government bills. So one example, for instance, was the Net Zero Review came up with 129 recommendations, of which the government supported 100. One of them that I was really keen to get across the line was a net zero duty on our regulator Ofgem. And in the end, the government said no to that initially, but it was due to cross-party pressure from parliamentarians that they did then decide to put that into the Energy Act. So I think it's really important to recognise the role and purpose of legislators that they can play in holding governments to account and go that extra mile to be more ambitious. And then just finally, and I'm sure other colleagues who are in the room and maybe will make some points as well in the discussion, face in two different directions as parliamentarians. One is obviously into the centre, into that purpose around our role as legislators. But then the other purpose we face is that as representatives. So being representatives of the communities that elected us. And I think when it comes to net zero, it's really important to recognise that one member of parliament represents a very different community to another member of parliament. It's one of the most fantastic things I've had about being a member of parliament for the past 14 years. Lots of different members of parliament come from lots of different types of profession, but they're often almost sort of drenched in the identity of their constituency. And they get to bring to the House of Commons a local and national perspective that's really important to reflect upon. And I think when we come up to a general election, obviously members of parliament will be fighting for their constituency interests, and it's how do we frame net zero away not just from the international, which obviously is really important, but how do we make sure that that international context is able to be reflected in those local conversations. Members of parliament will be going to meetings, holding hustings with their people who want to become their member of parliament in opposition parties. How can we ensure that the conversations we're having at COP28 can trickle down into those town hall hustings where people can say, this is what net zero will mean potentially in terms of new investment in a factory, this is what it will mean for new jobs in your community, this is potentially what it's going to mean in terms of rewilding an area of nature in your community. And that's what I'm really keen, is trying to find what I call the points of contact that we can make net zero climate action real. And that's why I'm hoping, working with Alex, we can establish or help re-establish that question about how do you build consensus, with at the same time having healthy disagreements about what that consensus might be for the future.
Thank you, Chris. So if I can just keep you on the domestic agenda for a couple of minutes, because of course the question that we're posing is rhetorical. It's assuming that nothing has happened in the past where there has been a shared agenda. But what you're describing is that there has been a shared agenda, and actually the sparring which there is amongst different political parties has led to a race to the top if we look at the 2008 Act. But is there a risk now of a race to the bottom, given how issues have become weaponized? And I'd just like you to both of you reflect on what are the issues that have become weaponized. So the narratives, the policies, the ideas, whether it's around heat pumps or travel, cars, food, those kind of issues.
I think that for me there's two separate points. One is the sort of level of ambition, where obviously at events like COP, lots of different organizations, groups, bring to the table a particular area of focus. So I often think of net zero like a Rubik's Cube. There's just so many things that people want to focus on. And as a politician, politics is about priorities, so we all need to prioritize what we think that pathway to net zero will look like. For myself, I sort of feel making sure we can take everyone with us, all communities with us, and that includes those who are fearful of the transition, who potentially do oppose net zero. When I did the net zero review, got now out as a book to try to sort of make the case that this is an economic opportunity, not just an environmental one, I met with my detractors called the Net Zero Scrutiny Group. And some people at the BBC said, why are you meeting with this group? They're anti-net zero. But the challenge is that you have to listen to every voice and to understand people's concerns. So one is around cost, undoubtedly. Now, once you sort of break that down, you realise that it's not as severe as it might have been. We had in the UK a question around the ultra-low emissions zone charge in London that came in. And it just happened we had this by-election in London about sort of 3 weeks before that charge came in. And this was weaponised because ultimately a lot of people thought that they were going to have to pay it, when in fact only 1 in 12 people had to pay it. And actually it's now in place, and all the opposition sort of died away slightly. And everyone thought this was the moment that the Conservative Party, if they oppose ULEZ, were going to be defeating the Mayor of London in next year's mayoral election. But if you look at the polling now, the Mayor of London's back at sort of like 30 points ahead. It has had really short-term impact at that one moment in 3 weeks, and then it's gone. And the duty, I think, as a politician is having that overview about thinking, what are the challenges that do have that short-term moment? And this could happen at the general election as well. We had this in the UK with something called social care in 2017, which it just came up at the wrong moment in time, and it became a big issue, as opposed to the long-term issues around the costs of people moving to electric vehicles. Are we going to have the charging points in place? If we haven't worked out how to make sustainability sustainable, we give the opponents of sustainability and net zero a gift, because then we demonstrate that we haven't prepared, we haven't thought through the transition properly, and we weaken our own arguments as a result.
Thank you. And of course, the example that you gave of ULEZ, so that was originally introduced by Conservative Mayor of London, Boris Johnson. So, Alex, I mean, to this point, you're very welcome to respond to the question that I, raised earlier, but I'm just wondering whether there is a political penalty for the two of you to come out as a Conservative and a Labour politician at this time as a double act, or whether actually you think that that's something that should be transforming the political landscape ahead of an election year.
I mean, I think this is where we're going to get all the consensus now. So I actually don't think that that's a danger at all. I think the important thing is to build a consensus, even if at certain points you're pushing harder on certain issues, and even if your own political parties may at a sort of strategic level disagree, and the Uxbridge by-election is a good example. I think there's an underlying thing here that the biggest public issue we face as politicians is people's fear about change. And actually, my view, the fear is misplaced. The real fear should be about the effects of what will happen if we don't do something. So physics is immutable. What we're looking at now is retrenchment of permafrost and of both polar ice caps. That could trigger, an effect where it just runs away, and we hit 4.5 degrees. That's what we should really be scared of. What we shouldn't be scared of is a managed transition and changing and having to have these changes. And my view, and this is maybe where the consensus goes a little bit, is where things are hard, that's where the role of the state and legislative regulation comes in. So the state should play a role to basically sit between individuals and their communities and the change and mitigate the fear and make it easy for them. So a lot of the fear in the UK is about cost. It's about cost, it's about economic effect. And actually, all the proof shows if you're an early mover, an early adopter, and you invest in the industrial strategy to achieve it, you're the big winner. In the UK, we failed to do that, for instance, on wind, and a lot of the wind industry is now owned in Europe, in Germany, and the Scandies, and we missed out on that opportunity. We need to be early adopters and early movers and own the industrial strategy. And that's where the jobs and transition will come in. Although I haven't written as extensively on this area as Chris, my all-party group, the All-Party Group Night Zero, has a 10-point roadmap, and the second point in the roadmap is about green skills. So actually, I think where we probably have collective failure is we have not invested enough and we have not done enough on green skills. And my party's not said enough on it, and we don't have a shadow green skills minister, and I'm afraid the government haven't done enough on it. And maybe there's some political consensus that actually we need to be thinking about the jobs of the future and the transition and utilising it as an opportunity and not looking at it as a cost. And the Green Prosperity Plan does that to an extent. It's a capital plan, but the revenue elements to support that capital plan are not currently in place. And there's an expectation the private sector will provide that. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. The jobs will come to the private sector for sure. But I think the state has a role there to ensure that we're providing those skills, that training, and the highlighting of that for future generations for them to be able to capture those opportunities. And that's where I think we need a new political consensus.
So you mentioned green skills, and you mentioned the lack of an effective green industrial strategy for the UK. In a way, for example, the European Green Deal is precisely that, in a much more systematic and consistent way. So you've mentioned that as an example of failure. I mean, I'm aware that there is a task force on green skills that's being implemented. But so that's a failure. Can you point to a success?
Okay. Well, I think offshore wind is a huge success. So the system of contracts for difference, which is now actually coming apart a little at the seams because the strike price is too low, so we just failed to sell in the last auction. But prior to that, it's usually successful and has meant that offshore wind has moved into sort of the top of the league table in terms of energy production in the UK. And in terms of delivery of offshore wind, we are a world leader. Maybe not on the industrial side, but certainly on the delivery side. And CFDs are a huge success story, which we need to see widened. And actually, the success story of the last auction was on floating wave technology. And so I think the UK will become a first mover on floating wave alongside some Northern European nations. And, you know, in a context like COP, technology transfer is hugely important. So the UK needs to think about its global responsibilities. And if we're a first mover and we're successful, we need to share that technology with other marine countries who can also implement it.
So to offer an observation, what we've seen in the last few days at COP, we've seen the Prime Minister here, the King, and also the Leader of the Opposition. And very interesting that the Leader of the Opposition is using language and frames that are much more associated with the Conservatives. So this is where you're seeing a cross-fertilization amongst the parties. And my question is, I wonder if climate change and the challenge of accelerating action to meet the net zero agenda is creating an area of political détente between parties. In the same way that you can use the example of the G2. So you remember going into Glasgow, where the US and the Chinese were not talking. And what an important moment it was when Kerry and Xi Jinping issued a declaration together. And just recently, again, to show that despite all the differences that there are politically on trade, economics, etc., climate is a safe space for cooperation.
I mean, I think the challenge is obviously to try to create that safe space, but equally make sure that it doesn't sort of lead to a reaction, which is that sort of you can't challenge sort of climate policy. Obviously, you know, the science is well founded, and that we need to recognise that there will be differences of opinion. So I think that we've got to. It shouldn't be off the table. That's the thing I think is important to recognise, that we've got to be, you know, ready to defend, you know, the value of what we're doing, both environmentally and economically. And I think the great thing we saw with the US-China relationship is that obviously if we can get sort of China to move in a particular direction along with India, environmentally that's fantastic. But also economically, the supply chains that we can create and the pressure that can be put on other aspects of foreign policy is also really important. So I personally see, you know, climate as a proxy for moving the dial elsewhere. So I remember when I was energy minister and we were looking to try to get COP26 for the UK. And other European countries were not allowed to talk to the UK on other aspects of my portfolio that included science, research, innovation. I was trying to get some space opening up on Association Horizon Europe. But then I took a call from the French minister who was saying, well, we're definitely going to back the UK's bid for COP26. It seems that there is a different standard, and that's what needs to be protected. You know, COP, the process, is the last multilateral process by which then whatever is agreed here will be written into international law and adopted by every single country. We underestimate that impact. But equally, energy and climate as a vector to be able to shift global supply chains, for instance, with China, you know, moving all solar panel manufacturing and saying we're not going to buy solar panels that are made by Uyghur slaves, you know, is also really important, because it sort of demonstrates that we will, you know, use our might to take decisions economically, where in other areas there isn't the ability to have that negotiation.
Indeed. And Alex, do you want to come back on that? Any thoughts on that question?
I mean, we need to think about the United Kingdom's role in the world and the history of the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom's soft power. And so, you know, intergovernmental organisations, interparliamentary organisations are an important role, and the UK has a very long-standing role. So if you think about something like the Commonwealth, you know, the UK sits at the heart of the Commonwealth. The King is the head of state for many Commonwealth countries still. And so the King, we sort of slightly forget in the UK, when the King came here, wasn't just representing the United Kingdom, he was representing all of those other countries where he's head of state, but also, more broadly, he was speaking to the Commonwealth. He might have also spoken on a European country as well with his tie, but that's another matter. But I think that we need to be cognizant of that, and we think about where we are in the United Arab Emirates and the Middle East and the role of oil and gas. The UK has got a very good relationship actually across different parties and with the King, with the countries of the Middle East, and they're going to be vital if we're going to get through this transition. And this COP is really needs to be a focal point for that, because if we're not going to transition away from oil and gas, my view and the physics shows we're not going to achieve 1.5 or even 2 degrees, and so the UK maybe have a different role there. I don't think the UK's got a role like the US with China. I think that is the US's role. But the UK can be an honest broker in many senses, and I think it needs to focus our international diplomacy where we have the greatest strength.
And do you think, so this is my final question to the two of you, and Carolyn, I'd like to come to you next, please. Do you think that in terms of that regional climate diplomacy, where you think that because of the history together, the soft power that the UK exerts, that is that something in terms of the strategy that there is cross-party consensus?
I mean, I don't think that's what we come to first. I think we do start with the UK context, but I'll give an example about the power of the UK and where this might have a really strong effect. So I think that the biggest bit of soft power we still have is the City of London. We are the world's global finance capital. When I was on the Environmental Audit Committee with Philip Dunn and Matthew Offord, who are here, we did a inquiry, and I think in terms of the EAC's power, when I was on the EAC, it's gone on to bigger and better things since Philip's become chair, but when I was on the EAC, I think this had the biggest effect. We did an inquiry into export finance guarantees. 99% of the export finance guarantees that have been signed by the UK for notionally British companies were for fossil fuel projects. We had a company that was notionally British, that had British registration, British headquarters, but no actual building, come before the committee. Both the members of that company flew in from Turkey, and they were building an oil refinery in Bahrain, which was underwritten by the British state. And it was shocking on a number of levels. And the government agreed to phase out, and has now ended the use of export finance guarantees for fossil fuels, and it's now for renewable projects. So that's that. For one, that shows the power of select committees, but two, that also shows the power of the City of London, because we were underwriting the city's investment. And if we can get the City of London to be a world leader in green finance and actually to effectively transition finance, and there is a really good project on this called Rewired Earth, which was started in the UK Parliament with people in the city, then that's a real game changer. If we can effectively say future capital flows are going to be for renewable projects, and actually we've got the thing now where high risk projects are viewed as renewable projects and low risk projects are fossil fuel because of the history. If we can flip that and get City of London to flip that, that actually is the best thing I think the UK can do internationally.
Indeed, that's a great point. Insurance and finance, both, I'd say, in terms of City of London. Chris?
Yeah, I think just extension of Alex's point. I've just come from the UK Pavilion, where they had an event on transition plan task forces, and it's the question around where does the UK show leadership as 1% of all emissions? How can it take that soft power and try to sort of promote an agenda that other countries will wish to take up? I think that question around regulation, around potential legislation, models that we can take forward, as Alex mentioned, obviously the contract for difference, and that's been something that other countries have been really interested in sort of adopting themselves. But we often forget that other question around standards, our building codes, that while we as legislators in the UK Parliament give the government a hard time over sort of the quality of those, they're still far better than what you have in the States. And also trying to create consistency and how you can get accountability through creating level playing fields. Now, whether around data, standardisation is something that, an extension of the City of London's work and the sort of Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, all these sort of initiatives that were sort of, even before COP26 had been sort of begun to emerge. And obviously Tom's here from sort of Oxford Net Zero, the work that has happened around measurement and managing that measurement is something the UK should be proud of and really continue to work to lead. And I know there's been a number of initiatives and launched today in the UK Pavilion, again, that's trying to sort of continue that. But it ultimately comes down to a broader question, which I think we can find wanting to protect the prize. And the prize, for me, is obviously not just delivering a clean energy transition, it's delivering a clean energy transition that also creates jobs and growth. And the UK has been a paragon of demonstrating how we've been able to decarbonise our economy by 48%, carbon dioxide emissions reductions on 1990 levels, and at the same time grow the economy by 70%. And if we can demonstrate to other countries that reducing your emissions will not lead to cutting jobs, decarbonisation will not lead to deindustrialisation, that in itself is something where the UK can really lead for the future.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Chris and Alex, both of you. Caroline, moving to you. You've listened to this. It's a domestic dialogue on the challenges, of Westminster. And I should put it in context, of course, because we're talking about the UK, but we've had examples from Westminster. And in the UK, there are the challenges of devolution, where you've now got the four nations with their own parliaments and assemblies. So it's much more complex now. Yeah. But from a Belize point of view, you have a different system in some respects. So let's start with the beginning, which the beginning question is about polarization. Do you see the same trends in your part of the world?
A couple of years ago, there was, I shouldn't say a couple, I think it was in 1999, there was a major thrust towards constitutional and political reform. And one of the issues that came up in terms of sustainability of programs and policies and cross-party collaboration, the conversation surrounded, but our country and our parliament is not set up for that, because at the time we still do, to give some context, we have a bicameral just like the UK. We have the lower house, which is the House of Representatives, only 31, not 600 and something I think that you have. And our Senate is only 13. However, the way the lower house is constructed, it's just two parties. But so you have the prime minister who leads the government, like yourself, and then we have the leader of opposition. And so the issue then becomes the fact that you are the leader of opposition and you represent the opposition party, that then means you oppose. So everything that comes out, you oppose. So then the conversation then became, should we have a party be referred to as an opposition party, because just the thought of it says that you will continuously be opposing. We're still there. We're now moving 20 years later and we're having another political and reform conversation. And the issue has again come up as to whether you have a majority party and a minority party and so on and so forth. So I put that in context as to say that the optics do suggest that. And perhaps how we defined work together may not sometimes necessarily mean working together at the same time. We have had situations, yes, where the opposition has supported a particular piece of legislation that have come out. It's rare, but it happens. We have seen where they have supported particular motions of the government. One of the most recent being the Women Political Caucus, which was supported unanimously by both houses, and it's a joint parliamentary committee. But in redefining working together, I have seen also where a successor government continues the policy of a predecessor government. So when we speak, for example, of issues like energy and energy transitioning from non-renewables to renewables, fossil and gas, and so on, to solar and electricity and so on and so forth, both parties have been on the same page. And so this is why I say one may not necessarily work together while you are together in parliament, but successor and predecessor works together on the same policies. So that's one way of working together. There is also many provisions for consultation between the government and opposition, but when it comes to different parties, we also have a very strong and robust civil society group. And so we have built-in mechanisms in our policy development where the government has stakeholder consultations with both the opposition as well as civil society. that is now embedded in the way we function. There is also, of course, the concept of consultation, because our constitution and many of our legislation requires the Prime Minister to write the leader of opposition to consult an appointment. But the issue becomes, what is consult? Is it just to write the letter, or do you take meaningful recommendations or advice? So that is constantly in the conversation as to what consult truly means when it comes between political parties. Now, at the level of the Senate, we have a rather unique system which does not compare to what we inherited initially, because as you all know, a system sort of is a mirror of what the UK is, the lower house. You all, the upper is the House of Lords, for us is the Senate. It's appointed. But the government does not have the majority in the Senate, even though they are the government. The way our Senate is configured, the government appoints 6 persons, the opposition appoints 3, and we have 4 social partners, 1 from union, 1 from the church, 1 from business, and 1 from NGO. And so there has to be cross-party collaboration, because the leader of government business has to at all times reach out to somebody in that social partner or the opposition to get a bill to pass. It doesn't affect money bills, even though we do have a debate and they do vote on it. But when it comes to any other bill and motion that goes for affirmative decision, the government side has to reach out. So that in its own way is a built-in mechanism for cross-party, but not necessarily cross-party in the political sense of political parties, but cross-party organizational engagement for bills, for legislation to progress. So in the lower house, there are some mechanisms, like I said, that is there. It's how we can redefine it. And in the Senate, it is even more so, because you have the leader of government business has to have someone in that social partner or the opposition agree to a bill.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That's a really interesting example of institutional innovation. I know that with the debates about the reform of the House of Lords, maybe you can look to Belize as an example on constitutional reform. But so at this point, it'd be great to open it up, please, for discussion. I see that there's some fingers in the audience already. Just a question that I'd like to pose. There may be some in the audience who are actually from multi-party systems where you are expected to form coalitions. That's not necessarily the long-term experience in the United Kingdom, but it'd be very good to get some insights from those who come from those systems. So let's start with the gentleman in the front, please. Do take the mic and introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Philip Dunn. I chair the Environmental Audit Committee in the UK House of Commons, and thank you both members and former members of the committee, Alex and Chris, for your comments today. As you said in your introduction, we've got an election in the UK almost certainly next year, and we've got an election in the United States certainly next year. The second question of the topic is how does climate change fare in an era of polarization? We've seen a number of elections where there have been populist governments elected and populist parties doing much better, both in Europe, Latin America, and around the world. To what extent do you think the polarization, meaning that in particular parties of the right identify the costs of climate change to individuals and focus on behavioral problems for individuals that are going to have to come to terms with, is likely to gather momentum over the next year, and what can we do to stop it?
Great question. Would you like to take that straight away? Shall I collect a couple? Yeah. Any other question? A rider question there? The lady in the front?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Lara. I'm an Antonian, actually. So nice to see you guys here. Thanks for the panel. I was just wondering, particularly in the current climate, now this is more of an international foreign policy question, it's becoming increasingly clear how GHGs are produced from conflict and conflict zones, increasingly clear the effects on land, etc., water, and I'm just wondering how both the Labour and the Conservative Party are planning to address the effects of climate change on conflict, conflict on climate change, and how both parties aim to express those ideas to the general UK public as well as your MPs, given the most recent rejection of a ceasefire. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And a third question, perhaps? Oh, gosh, 3 and 4. Okay, the gentleman over here.
Hi everyone, my name's George Carroll-Jones. I'm from the UK Youth Climate Coalition, we have a few members here. For all the MPs in the audience, if you have young people coming to you saying, what can I do about climate change, point them in our direction, please. My question is, quite often what is seen to, polarization is often created through the media. And if you take the example of heat pumps, which are constantly panned in the UK media, and there's this perception that people hate heat pumps, comparative to Norway, where they have a 60% penetration and people seem to like them a lot. What do you think is the role of the media in kind of creating an air of polarization when in fact there's quite a lot of cross-party consensus? Yeah, that's basically the question.
Fantastic. And the gentleman over there, pithy question, please.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Rakiab, and I'm based in the Netherlands. I work there as civil servant, but partly of me, as you stand on that side, my background is an indigenous West Papuan. And I just joined another panel before here, which is climate finance, and looking at how can different parties work together. I think it's really urgent that it happened. And looking at how indigenous peoples are the guardians of more than 80% of world's remaining biodiversity. And at the same time, 96% of all the deforestation due to our way of consuming happens on indigenous lands. Reports are showing that less than 1% of global funding goes to indigenous-led initiative for protecting, for example, protecting forests. So I think there's hope when we have a hopeful story, how indigenous peoples can take the lead if institutions and parliamentarians, governments are working together to give them a voice. So my call would be, how can parliamentary groups working together to protect the rights and lives of indigenous people so we can stop deforestation and bring forward true climate solutions.
Thank you very much. And just for those who are joining us online and can't see, we are directly across from the Indigenous Pavilion. And yesterday here in the Parliamentary Pavilion, we hosted the launch of Planet Caucus, which was initiated by Congresswoman Celia Sacriaba, the indigenous leader from Brazil, bringing together the climate and the indigenous rights agenda through parliaments. So who would like to start with their first reflections on the questions that you've heard? Chris?
Thanks for all those excellent questions, and I think some of them relate to each other. So sort of Philip's point, obviously around the oncoming sort of general elections and also the US presidential election, I think that the big challenge, they say in politics, you either own the issue or the issue owns you. And I think getting out on the front foot is so important here. I think we've seen that in the United States, with the Inflation Reduction Act. It's not there to reduce inflation at all, but the narrative is obviously, it's not called the Net Zero Act, but Joe Biden and the team that he has put in place has come out to really sell this as economic regeneration, a second industrial green revolution. And that narrative is really important because it comes back to those points of contact that I mentioned earlier and that Alex alluded to, green skills, new jobs, economic growth, regional regeneration. And the point is that the media is obviously the filter by which the narrative of the general election will be fought. So the gentleman's point, obviously we've seen a growth in the new media, which sort of mirrored the sort of Fox News agenda in the United States. I personally don't go on some of these programs if I sort of think that they're setting up false debates, and that's the challenge I think in sometimes with the media is how do you recognize that this whole idea of equivalence, creating sort of an equal voice. There are certain sort of programs where they deliberately are trying to set you up, and I think your role as a legislator representative is to make sure you don't fall into some of those traps. But equally, the role of the BBC and equally is a responsibility to recognise that certain voices are not equal, that certain people are going on in bad faith to make certain cases, and how do you try to create a context where you can have a healthy debate, but equally, whereas someone represents, millions of people's opinion versus someone who represents maybe sort of 5 people's opinion, or I don't know, maybe that's an exaggeration. But I found that myself when I took forward a sort of net zero support group. I only set something up because there was a net zero scrutiny group that I mentioned earlier. And then I found actually trying to get equal space on the agenda. You can do that. And that's where I think, in the run-up to general election, creating the platforms by which you can come out and demonstrate the opportunity. So the heat pumps is a great example, and there have been certain energy companies like Octopus who've gone out of their way now not just talk about net zero, but net zero bill homes. And actually there we've reached the tipping point. Heat pumps are going to be cheaper than gas boilers, but equally nobody has ever said you were going to be forced to rip out your gas boiler, replace it with a heat pump. What we need to make sure is that we take forward an agenda that we're able to make the positive case for why we are doing what we are doing, but we also don't fight this on the detractors' territory, on the territory they want to. Don't ever sort of be in a place where you are defending ripping out people's gas boilers. The point here is the transition is the transition. The best thing to do is you've got your petrol car, and then when it reaches the end of its life, you move to an EV. The same with your gas boiler. And I try to sort of say we're living in remarkable times. The climate crisis is a moment for our generation to solve. But the way we do it is quite unremarkable. The energy transition itself is no different from the fact that we've all got mobile phones that were very different 10 years ago. Just the price point came down, the technology evolved. And that'll be the same for all other sort of climate technologies as well. No one bemoaned the loss of their DVD collection to Netflix. We've all got flat screen TVs, dotted around here that used to cost thousands and thousands of pounds, and now they cost hundreds of pounds. This is the reality of the transition. Is it's going to happen, and trying to make the case rationally and based in facts, that actually it's those people who oppose this that actually are being ideological. Don't let us fall into the trap of being seen as the ideological ones, as being the net zero zealots, because we certainly aren't.
Excellent, thank you. Alex, over to
Okay,
you.
so I'm going to try and link the Philip's question and the other question about populism, and then the one about conflict with the one about indigenous people and deforestation in West Papua. So I'm going to use a different example. I'm not going to use heat pumps. I'm going to use the example of 15-minute neighbourhoods. So in the UK, we have this concept 15-minute neighbourhood. And in politics, when you're explaining, you're losing, but I'm going to explain it. And we need to keep explaining it, because people really don't understand it. So the idea is that you can access all of the services you need, health services, food, entertainment, whatever it is, within 15 minutes walk of your front door. And this has been leaped upon by the populist right in all sorts of places on the dark web and all of that sort of thing, to say this is a conspiracy to stop you leaving your neighbourhood. So you can only go within 15 minutes of your front door. It's like a sort of Kafkaesque conspiracy against individual freedom. That's the whole thing. And actually, when you think about it, why should people, not having 15-minute neighbourhoods is detrimental to the poorest in our society who can't afford motor vehicles, because they have to utilise public transport, which in lots of parts of the country is poor. And two, why shouldn't people be able to walk and get everything they need within a short distance? Actually, what I find most ironic about it is these same people who say, well, Britain was much better, 60, 70, whatever. There was a golden age. And actually, that golden age is when you could walk 15 minutes and get all your services. So there's a bit of an irony here. But so I'm a strong supporter of 15-minute neighbourhoods and not having to utilise car ownership to drive somewhere to get services. And actually, in a transition world, that's where we need to be, and have much more local involvement in service provision. And I think we can probably get cross-party consensus on that if we don't politicise the issue to that extent. And I think the media has a big role to play, because that even some mainstream media outlets, they'll come and they'll have, some sort of shock jock taking apart 15-minute neighbourhoods and say, and it's Labour councils mainly that are doing it. The Labour councils take away your right to drive, they're closing your road, they don't want to let you leave your neighbourhoods, and it's just, it's just rubbish, really. So so I won't get on my hobby horse about that. So the second one, so funnily enough, the person that asked the first question, Philip, has set up an all-party group on climate and security, which I'm a vice chair of, and because Philip's very far-sighted, he's foreseen that climate is going to be a major driver of conflict, and it's doing work on a number of issues. So one is, what is the and I'm not going to talk about this because it's not what your question was. What is the effect of conflict on the climate, on biodiversity, etc., which is something really important. I'm the chair of the Ukraine group, and we're seeing it very strongly in Ukraine. But secondly, climate as a driver of conflict. Now, most of the conflicts we see today, we don't think of climate as a driver, but they are in all of them somewhere there. So if we think, in the example you gave, about Israel and Palestine, not in Gaza, but in the West Bank, where are water supplies for the people of Palestine and Israel? They sit in the River Jordan and around the West Bank. And there's a driver there around water supply. By the way, I voted for a ceasefire. So, if you look at Ukraine, Russia actually, in the former Soviet Union, Russia doesn't have the largest store of rare earth metals. Ukraine has more rare earth metals than Russia does. Some of the other Soviet republics do as well. I'm not saying that's the main driver and it's geopolitical, but it's somewhere there. Now, coming to your question, if you look at Indonesia, if you look at where the largest gold mine in Indonesia is, the largest copper mine in Indonesia, that's in West Papua. It's conflict-driven, the driving out of indigenous peoples from their homes, of that conflict, palm oil deforestation. Those are drivers of the conflict in West Papua. And we're going to see that more and more. Philip's group's doing really good work around Africa. If we look at Central Africa and Wagner, that's about water. If we look at Maghreb, Western Sahara, that's also not originally, but now becoming a climate issue. And we're going to have more and more climate conflicts. And what we need to do is have early intervention. And the UK's got responsibility in terms of money, in terms of technology transfer, and the United Nations got an even bigger responsibility in trying to put systems in these stressed environments to ensure that conflict doesn't happen. And the other bit we didn't talk about is migration, but I'm going to stop there because that's a slightly different issue.
Thanks very much. And on that note, just to great to hear that there is this new APPG. I remember in 2007 actually that the UK had introduced the first ever debate on conflicts and security in the Security Council. And that was specifically around climate security issues. So this is dated very well. There's a whole degree of work which has been done on this. Carolyn, I'd like to come to you for your final thoughts, please. And then as we approach the last few minutes, I'm going to turn to you, Tom, and help us, give us a preview of what you have in store for the coming year. Carolyn.
Thank you. Belize has been independent for 42 years. I think this year we reached 40. So clearly we are learning as we are going along. Our parliament, as I had mentioned, initially mirrored that of the UK. But over time, we're trying to figure out what works for us. And I think that's very important. Clearly, cross-party collaboration is good. But if you stick solely to political parties, then you may find we may not progress as far as we wish. A lot of the changes within our constitution and within our parliamentary makeup came from strong and robust civil society engagement. In fact, before we had what we call the 13th senator, which is the NGO senator, it was really 6 and 6, and the presiding officer was the one who did the casting vote if there was a tie. Now the presiding officer don't do the casting vote because it was given to the 13th senator. They brought in the 13th senator. But how that came about is also very important because the civil society with strong union engagement came together and collaborated collectively to address issues of corruption and mismanagement in the current government at that time. And there were several demands for legislative change, and one such change had to do with the 13th senator and ensuring that the government, even though you may have the majority in the lower house, when it comes to the upper house, you have a check and balance, a better check and balance. And the idea is, at least if you can get one senator across to you, then that means it is good. So it's not relying solely on the lower house. I say that simply to say that sometimes we have to explore options, and it is not just about cross-party, it is also about engaging civil society and having civil society be a key player in our democracy.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And let's bring it to a close now. So, Tom, first day at COP, what can we look ahead to?
Thank you so much for these reflections. Thank you so much for these reflections. This is, I think, a really fantastic opening to the conversation, a really vital conversation on how we build not just a common climate around these issues, but actually a common political approach across these issues, having the debate, but having the consensus on where we need to get to. In the coming series we're going to be having in Oxford, and I will invite anyone who's in the UK to come join us in person, or those of you who would like to join online, they'll also be available there. We're going to be talking about these things in a lot more depth. We're thinking about the geopolitics of this. What is the position of a country like the United Kingdom in the race for the future of the economy and the big superpower politics we see unfolding around these questions? What is the domestic situation looking like as we approach a general election in a much more polarized context, perhaps than before? How do we deal with the media? How do we deal with these hot button issues? How do we ensure that that's building a positive politics around climate change and not tearing down where we know we need to get to? And then we're going to dig into some of the key issues. What do we do on transportation? What do we do on land in a country that's quite densely populated and has a lot of demands on the land available? What do we do on buildings, on all these different topics? So I invite you all to join us for that conversation and to add your voices. Final thing to say, though, I've really inspired, Senator, by your vision for political reform. Because if you take a very long view, and we at Oxford have been around for quite a while, actually, it'd be very surprising if in this age of climate change, because it's extending into the deep future to the many future generations to come, that politicians and political decisions look today like they will in the future. And actually, no legislator, no government has ever made decisions in a world shaped by climate change. And so we, at the university, really want to think about that and how we weave climate change not into some kind of course you take or don't take, but actually is mainstreamed into something that every single leader, every single decision maker, every single citizen in the future really needs to understand if we're going to build a common climate, if you will, for us all to thrive in. So thank you so much to Globe for hosting this conversation. Thank you, Carolyn, Chris, Alex, for your fantastic comments, and we're looking forward to carrying it forward.
Thank you so much, Tom. And can I end on a high also, because of course this is your first day at COP. In the last few days, we've seen some remarkable consensus emerging, and I just look back to Giorgia Meloni. Who would have expected that Giorgia Meloni, far-right national Italian parliamentarian, would have contributed 100 million euros to the Loss and Damage Fund? So surprises are taking place, and you heard it first here, so please do come back to the Parliamentary Pavilion tomorrow and during the rest of the 2 weeks. But for now, thank you very much to all of our fantastic panelists and to everybody who's